Thanks for listening to Limelight Arts Travel series, Music Matters. In each episode, we'll be talking to one of Limelight's experts about composers, musicians, music history, and performances. In this episode, Limelight publisher Robert Veel talks with critic Clive Paget about Gustav Mahler, his life and times, musical influence, and enduring legacy.
In May 2023, Limelight Arts Travel is offering a tour that culminates in the Mahler Festival in Leipzig in Germany, but begins in Vienna and travels through Mahler's hometown in Bohemia and Prague. To find out more about the tour, we're chatting to the tour leader, Clive Paget, who is also the editor-at-large for Limelight magazine. Hello, Clive.
Hi, Robert. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Well, we're beginning this journey by traveling to Vienna and Bohemia. And then we go on to Leipzig, where we hear all of the performances of all of the symphonies. How will this first part of the trip, traveling to Vienna and Bohemia, how will this help us to understand and appreciate the music that we hear in Leipzig?
He grew up in Bohemia. He was an enormous walker. He walked everywhere. I mean, some people say that just the rhythm of his walking actually impacts his music. So growing up in Bohemia, he was surrounded by the sounds of the Bohemian countryside, the music coming out of the local inn, the fanfares coming out of the barracks. They're all there in the music. So getting a feel for that kind of world that he must have grown up in, I think will help enormously. Vienna is a little more interesting. I mean, what you hear in the music that was composed while he was at Vienna is not so much a reflection of Vienna itself as the very turbulent part of his career that he spent there. Both the personal kind of triumphs and tragedies and the professional ones, they impacted enormously the symphonies he wrote while he was living in Vienna.
Indeed, turn of the 20th century, Vienna is a remarkable time for the city, and it's a remarkable place. And I guess you need to put Mahler in that context as well. I mean, exactly how new was his music to the ears of music lovers at the time? How was it received by the Viennese audience?
Well, it's an interesting thing, really. I mean, Mahler, his time in Vienna, he was not really recognized as a composer. All of the symphonies that he wrote while he was in Vienna premiered outside of Austria. The fourth, fifth, and sixth, I think, premiered in Germany, and the seventh premiered in Prague. So it wasn't until, I think, the ninth symphony that it was the first time that a symphony of Mahler's had actually was performed in Vienna as such, and by which stage Mahler was dead. So the Viennese had a very different view of him. I think they may have had a sort of sense of him as this kind of maverick composer whose music was quite often dismissed. What the Viennese would have recognized Mahler as was this great reforming figure at the Vienna Opera. I mean, not just in terms of raising artistic standards. He was the most extraordinary conductor possibly of his generation. And the performances there were, by all accounts, sublime. But he also had really radical ideas in terms of how he presented the operas themselves visually. That they were far more abstract in their thinking than the very, very traditional realism that had been had up until then. And he also, on the downside, as far as the Viennese audience was concerned, did all sorts of things which they probably thoroughly disliked, such as not letting people in after the performance had started. I mean, he was I mean, people used to bribe the attendants to let them in after the performance had started because Mahler's instructions were that they were not allowed so to do, and that often meant, a bit in a Wagner opera, sitting in the foyer for an hour and a quarter before you were actually allowed into the auditorium. Such things are still with us today, and Mahler was one of the kind of cheerleaders for that kind of approach. He also did quite, I mean, it doesn't sound radical now, but there was always an interval in Das Rheingold until Mahler came along. And he kind of went, no, this goes straight through 2.25 hours. I mean, it's there should be no interval. He did a lot of positive things as well. That he raised the pay for the musicians. He spent a lot of time trying to get rid of the claque. There were paid supporters of the various star performers. So, I mean, there was a lot that he was known for there. I mean, he was a superstar figure in Vienna. People recognized him in the street, but not as a composer.
It's wonderfully interesting. I think we'll have to be very sure that we're on time for our performances when we're in Vienna. I would hate to be locked out for the entire performance. And look, I want to get back to this idea about sort of recognizable and traditional and radical. I guess one of the things that many people love about Mahler's music is there are sort of recognizable traditional elements, and we'll talk about that. On the other hand, though, it's put into a new context, and it seems an entirely new way of thinking about orchestral sound.
Yeah, I mean, Mahler was a great innovator. But he was also a maverick. I mean, the part of Mahler's problem was harmonically he's relatively conventional. Yeah, he's not doing sort of extraordinary, startling discords that other people weren't doing around at the time. He was aware of like Schoenberg and those more kind of experimental composers. And in the 10th symphony, he does in the one movement that was completed. There's that extraordinary moment where he plays all 12 notes of the scale within about 2 bars of music, and you get the sense that what he's saying there is, I know what you can do with these with these notes, but I choose to remain within some kind of traditional harmonic structure. But at the same time, I mean, he does sort of sonata form, but incredibly drawn out and extended. So, and with kind of episodes in it which don't conform to what people would have expected at the time. It swings to extremes. It can feel episodic. All of those things were not normal things at the time. He had a few instrumentational novelties. There's the mandolin in the Seventh Symphony. There's the flugelhorn in the Third Symphony, for example. There's the hammer, of course, in the Sixth Symphony. Not necessarily standard orchestral instruments. I think when you really start to listen to Mahler's music, what you realise is that is most extraordinary about it is the instrumental combinations that he comes up with. And he spent a lot of time agonising about whether they'd work or not. And one of his real problems was that he never got to hear his music played more than, quite often it would just be the premiere and then wouldn't be heard again for 3 or 4 years. And when you think, I mean, the guy died when he was 50. He'd only had about, 20 years or so to listen to his kind of music. I think it must have been quite tricky for him to know what would work in the circumstances, especially these works which are so huge and on such an enormous scale. I mean, you must kind of think, if will this be heard against the 5 horns here, or but that I think is where his kind of innovation lies.
And indeed, he seems to have a feel for it. If he's only heard the symphony once, he seems to know, even in the later symphonies, exactly where to place the instruments and how to combine them. He has such a gift for that. Just moving to the second part of the tour, where we go up to Bohemia, his hometown of Jihlava, and then also Prague, where the Prague Festival's on. Bohemian music in particular has a place, I think, in the European tradition. We think of Dvorak and Janáček. Often, of course, for them, there's a national or a nationalistic feel or use of that music. Mahler uses traditional music and tavern music, as you've even said, but he uses it in quite a different way. It's much more personal, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, most people don't realize that Mahler was a Czech composer. Most people think of him as probably an Austrian composer, but he was born within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but in what we now know as the Czech Republic. Dvorak waltz may have a Czech feel, but it's there it's there as a Czech waltz. With Mahler, when Mahler uses a waltz, or more often the Ländler, the kind of Viennese Czech form of the waltz, he does it as part of it's always part of his storytelling. So a Mahler Ländler can be a heady whirling experience, or it can be a bitter sardonic experience. It can be all sorts of things. If you think about for example, the marches as well, you see, again, a very traditional form. Beethoven puts a march into the Ninth Symphony, and when Beethoven does that, he just wants to kind of create the sense of a march, or a sense of kind of military thing. But irony. I mean, Mahler does irony in marches. I mean, if you think about the First Symphony, third movement, which is inspired by the painting of a doll's funeral, effectively. It's ironic, and there's a smile behind the music, but also there are always multiple layers to Mahler music. And I take the Fifth Symphony. I mean, the funeral march there kind of stretches over two movements. I mean, you can imagine it lasting half an hour. I mean, that's quite a long time for a march to work in a symphony, and yet it never feels repetitive as such. Because he has this incredible facility for variety and other things that come in and interrupt it, and comes back again.
Given what was to happen to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and indeed all of Europe, in the decade following Mahler's death, that seems almost prescient in that way. But let's turn now to Leipzig, which is, of course, the core of the tour. We're getting to hear all of the symphonies, the Song of the Earth, and a few other orchestral works. Now, that's quite a program, even, I think, for a Mahler lover. Won't we get a bit bored after the third concert?
No, we will not get bored. Mahler. The very famous quote about Mahler about symphony must contain the world. Each of Mahler's symphonies contains a world, but it's a different world each time. He famously started out with the First Symphony, making it very clear what the kind of hero's journey through. Sets off into the countryside and passes the inn and the dance, and then goes ultimately to the kind of hero's battle and ultimate triumph. He was very clear about what that meant. But then when he came to do the Second Symphony, he kind of reverses that idea. It starts with the funeral of the hero and leads through to his ultimate resurrection. And he told people and wrote program notes which said what those movements meant. Later on, he became much more cagey about that. Didn't give those kind of program notes, and went back and kind of removed them. So I think in a way, Mahler wanted us to draw our own conclusion to some of these things. But all the same, I mean, if you think each of those symphonies is a journey, it's a different journey each time. And sometimes the protagonist is very, very clearly Mahler himself. But very often, I think you or I could imagine it being our own journey. And that's his genius, really, is his ability to be both intensely personal to him with music that can be intensely personal to us.
Our own journey writ very large. Now, looking at the different orchestras, I think one of the wonderful things about this tour is you're going to get to hear some of Europe's very, very best orchestras and some of the world's leading conductors right now all together in the one place. Is there a spirit of the age, as the Germans would say, a Zeitgeist? Should we expect that in 2023 all conductors and orchestras, the way that they approach Mahler is relatively the same, or can we expect some striking differences with the personalities of the orchestras and the conductors?
I think Mahler is one of those composers whose music lends itself least to the idea that there's a set way of performing. There are conventional is probably not the right word, but within that list of conductors, there are people like Christian Thielmann, for example, who feels fairly mainstream European approach to a lot of that kind of music. Andreas Nelsons as well, I would put in that kind of category, both very exciting conductors, but not necessarily conductors who will tinker and offer something incredibly different. But then there are others. I mean, Ivan Fischer, who's been conducting these works for 40 years, is one of the most thoughtful conductors, I think, that and his Mahler interpretations are legendary. And also they have developed over the years. So, I heard him do the Fifth Symphony about 4 years ago in New York. I don't assume that I would be hearing the same interpretation again, because for him, Mahler it's a lifetime's journey, and he's on that journey himself. Very interestingly, Semyon Bychkov, for example, who I had the pleasure of interviewing very recently, was telling me how he'd spent hours in his kitchen on the first two bars of the opening of the Fourth Symphony, trying to get it right, looking at the music, and this is a 70-year-old this year, senior maestro, and there he is in his kitchen, just trying to get the pace right of the very first and how that works. And I don't know about you, but I've always found the Fourth Symphony can live or die on those first two bars. And he admitted he'd spent hours and hours trying to get what I felt was one of the more perfect interpretations of that. So I kind of feel whatever he's going to offer is going to be very, very thought through. And then there are other I suppose, maverick conductors. Is Daniel Harding? Daniel Harding often tries something. I love a Daniel Harding performance, but sometimes he tries something and you think, "Oh my word, that doesn't work." I'd rather hear that than. And also, I have to say that he's released two absolutely brilliant recordings of Mahler symphonies. I would be really looking forward to hearing what someone like that does with that. Similarly, Mirga, whose surname I will still not attempt to pronounce, she also often does something utterly unexpected. So I would be, and I've never heard her conduct Mahler, so I would be fascinated to know what her Mahler sounds like.
Well, what a wonderful feast of music in store for the people who are coming on this tour. And imagine having you as their guide. You've got such a deep knowledge, of course, of the performers. We know that from the interviews and the profiles that you've been writing for many years now for Limelight, but such a deep understanding and love of the music. Thank you so much, Clive, and thank you to everybody who's listened to this podcast from Limelight Arts Travel.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travel series, Music Matters. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.